Hello all. Let's take some time to run through the Deuteronomy slides today. First of all, the first slide talks about the structure and contents of this nice large book. It's quite a long text, and it comes up as a series of addresses by Moses to the Israelites as they're waiting on the east side of the Jordan River to pass into the Promised Land. It also contains a third-person narrative of Moses' death, and you can discover the chapter and verse numbers of each of these 5 addresses in the slide itself. So I'm not going to reiterate those here in the video. What's going on in here? Slide number 2 talks a little bit more about the contents and the function of the book of Deuteronomy. In a way, it functions as a catechesis. In other words, the story of what God has done for the Israelites in the past. And you'll notice there's quite a lot of reiteration of things there. But it also functions then as instructions for those living as God's people. It functions even now as Torah for those who are living a life in association with God. It also includes an exhortation to commitment and to loyalty, which was tremendously important before going in to take over the Promised Land. These are the generations that were not at Horeb, not at Sinai, but they are included also in the covenant that was made there. And that's an important point, that when we talk about Horeb, we're also talking about Sinai and the Sinai covenant. There are 2 basic genres here in the book of Deuteronomy. First is reported speech, and the second is law. And when we say law here, there are parts of this that are sacral law, in other words, law that has to do with sacred spaces. It also has some ideas of law that would be included on how the Israelites were expected to live with one another. This law fits into the other law collections in the Pentateuch. In the slide called Genre, Law Collections in the Pentateuch is pretty useful. We talk about categories that have been established by scholars to discuss larger portions of the text. For example, the Book of the Covenant in Exodus 20:22 through 23:22, and again at 34:11 to 26, is a unique setting in that it's at Sinai. It's prior to the tabernacle. It contains the text of the covenant and ratification. Okay, so that's Exodus 20 through 23. Priestly law is found at 25 to 31 in Exodus, and also later in the book of Leviticus at 17 through 26. Here the setting is a little different. We have the tabernacle at Sinai in the wilderness, and they're waiting for themselves to get across the wilderness, but it's addressed to the tabernacle congregation, in other words, the wanderers. Okay. The Deuteronomic law at Deuteronomy 12 to 26 has yet a different setting. Now the Israelites are in the plains of Moab. They're the second generation. They're the ones who are actually going to enter the land. And so we have another series of different types of law and commands in Deuteronomy 12 to 26. So these are some of the bigger collections of law that you'll find in the Pentateuch. And we want to remember that law is not all the sort of law we might think about today as case law, but rather it's Torah. It's instructions for how to live a good life with your neighbor and with God. The style, literary style here, is basically narrative, with exception of the farewell address at the end. So we have a lot of narrative going throughout this book of Exodus. The literary context, Deuteronomy. The literary context it's the last book of the Pentateuch. Okay. Now, scholars are not completely in an agreement that this is a treaty form, but the historical context gives good reason to think that there are some echoes of a treaty form that we do find in the book of Deuteronomy. In other words, we can look at chapters 1 to 4 as a historical prologue, chapters 5 to 26 as stipulations to a covenant, 10:1 to 5 gives provision for deposit and reading. In other words, where are we going to keep this? And then, of course, chapter 28, the blessings and the curses, which become extremely important when you get to some of the prophets, such as Jeremiah, which reflect back onto this entire set of blessings and curses. Okay. Number 6, we have traditions in intertext. In other words, how does this text fit within other texts in the Old Testament? How does it fit within itself? And Dennis Olson has a good book out called Deuteronomy and the Death of Moses, put out by Fortress Press in 1994. In here, he lays out what I've written for you on the slide, the 10 Commandments on the one side, and how they sort of are reflected back in the following chapters, 12 to 26. Okay, so we have different categories here of the Ten Commandments, and then we have other ideas that come back on us throughout. They're reiterated in the following chapters. Okay, so the second slide actually shows the correspondence between Deuteronomy 5, 6 to 21 and Deuteronomy 6, 26 through 26. And you can go through each of those points and see where those chapters actually reflect back on the basic concept. So on one hand, we have the Ten Commandments, which are sort of like the main points of an outline. And then from 6 on, we have the idea of how that outline might be fleshed out a little bit. And this is Dennis Olson's theory here, and it does play out if you start going through those examples, which where we're sitting in class, we probably would take some time to work in a group and do that kind of thing. So I would encourage you at some point to take some time and look at one or two of them just to see how they play out. Okay. Now, also in the idea of biblical tradition or intertextuality, these Deuteronomic laws restate or develop laws from the Book of the Covenant. So we're going to see reflections of things that we've already seen in the Book of the Covenant. The law of the firstborn is found in both. The 3 feasts are found in both, and also in Leviticus. The idea of cities of refuge are found in both Deuteronomy and Exodus, as well as Numbers. The idea of a sabbatical year, the idea of Hebrew slaves. What did it mean to be a slave in that time frame? And then also the idea of different kinds of loans. So again, the slide here is meant to be sort of a topic of reflection. So take some time, perhaps in one of your daily routines of reading the Bible for yourself, to go through a few of these things to see how they reflect one another back and forth. And this is what we do term as intertextuality. How does the text reflect back and forth between different books? Now, the book of Deuteronomy has some theological issues. This would be number 8 of the 10 things we're looking at. And the first primary one we can put into the idea of oneness or unity. For the book of Deuteronomy, there is one God. There's one revelation. There's one people who are chosen and given one land, and one place of worship, and one priesthood. We find out later that the one land gets divided amongst 12 different tribes, but at this point in time, it is one specific people. The idea of the one God is reflected in Deuteronomy 6, 4-6, which is one of the most well-recited pieces of text for Jewish people. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Keep these words I am commanding you today in your heart. And the reason for this being where it is in the book of Deuteronomy is that there is a big danger of apostasy, that the people would fall into apostasy when they came into the land of Canaan, who worshipped many other gods. Okay? The one revelation at Sinai/Horeb is seen in Deuteronomy 1, 5, 1-5, 29, 29, and 30, 11-14. We see that they're going to be a witness to other nations, that this one revelation is a path to life, that it can inadvertently become a witness against Israel. The king eventually will also be under the law, and it mentions forbidden forms of meditation. The idea of one people chosen and given one land becomes a sort of fulfillment of the promise to Abraham in prior times in the book of Genesis. So we begin to see this book of Genesis coming to fruition here. The land is given to them, according to the text, because of the wickedness of the Canaanites. Okay, so some people would wonder, why would this land get turned over to them? According to this story, it's because the Canaanites were wicked. This land was to be a bountiful land. It also ends up being a context for temptation. So there's pros and cons here for the people. It also excludes the land that was given to the descendants of Esau and Lot. And that's kind of an important thing if you look into some more of the history. At this point, we don't have a big emphasis on tribal division. Okay, so later on we talk about where the different tribes lived, and you'll find many Bibles will have a map divided according to the tribes. But at this point in time, it's one land with the people going in. And also, this land is not necessarily just flat out guaranteed. It could possibly be lost. Okay. Now, this land was chosen by the Lord to put his name there. Okay. And if you look at Deuteronomy as being a later composition, it's an interesting thing here that the land is not named as being this particular land. It's just a place chosen by the Lord. So an early date fits and a later date also fits because we don't have it tagged as a specific spot. The priesthood was meant to prevent false worship. Okay, and so we also have the talk of the cultic obligations. And again, I don't think we've discussed too much about Leviticus so far, but the idea of the cult purely means a system of worship. It does not go to the idea that we would think of nowadays as a cult. Okay, at this point, something has changed because worship and government become centralized in Jerusalem. And this is indicated by the instructions for the pilgrimage feasts in 16. The idea that there is a judicial system as opposed to sort of smaller types of law. The idea